Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and we are in the middle of a series of episodes on warfare. Last week, we talked about making agreements with evil and how those agreements bind us. Today, we're going to take a break from the series to hear Susan's story. Part of my interview with Susan includes a discussion about an agreement that she made. I wanted to make the last episode very practical by sharing a specific example of someone who made an agreement with evil in a moment of heartache so that you could see how it played out in somebody's life. In the next episode after this one, we will pick back up with the warfare series. Thanks so much for listening. Here's my conversation with Susan. Okay, welcome to the podcast. I have Susan with me. Susan, it is good to see you.
Hey, Adam. It's good to see you.
Say a little bit about yourself and kind of where you are geographically.
Okay, well, I'm in Tennessee. I am a wife and a mom of two young men, now 17 and 20, so we're about to be empty nesters. I'm also an English teacher and a writer.
And we are going to talk story today. You're going to read a story after a little bit that you've written and generously agreed to share. But let's start off by just kind of talking about your journey of engaging your story. Like, when did you first learn that you even had a story?
I think I have always been so captivated by the idea of story. I can remember from just being a little girl, something in my heart deeply connecting with story. I think it was in story that I kind of found myself and also could lose myself. My favorite place was the elementary school library, or once a month I would get a book in the mail from the I Can Read book club, and those were my favorite times. And in particular, I loved the stories of the Bible. We had a lot of storybook Bibles in our home, and I would just sit and read the stories of the Bible. And something in those narratives really deeply resonated with me as a little girl. I can in particular remember reading the story of Moses when his sister put him in the basket and the Egyptian princess, saved him out of the river. Part of my story is adoption. And so as I read that story of Moses, it felt like part of my story, like there's something special about me. I remember the story of Samuel when he heard the voice of God, and Ruth and her faithfulness. I remember the story of Mary and how Mary experienced the divine. And even as a little girl, I felt like all of that was kind of true for me as well. It felt just larger than life. And I really felt that was true about me. But I grew up in an evangelical church that was very conservative. And so pretty soon the script was amended that my story was, you're a good girl. And eventually your story will be that you'll be a submissive wife and a devoted mother. And I think that there was a real loss of heart because I really dreamed of having a big story. And it just didn't seem like that was my role to play. And so I did my best to kind of live that story of being the good girl. And eventually I did marry and had kids. And while I loved those, being a wife and a mom, I just still knew something was just missing. I felt like a part of me was lost. And so it was really when I was 30 that another book fell in my hands that was really pivotal. It was a book that reinterpreted the biblical narrative for me in a way that was much larger and expansive than I had been taught, and really echoed the things that my heart knew as a little girl. And so that book kind of planted a seed in me to reimagine what God's story is, and that I have a bigger role in it than I had been led to believe. So I started that. I would have been 30 at that time, kind of reimagining or just asking, what is my story?
What was the book?
It was a book called The Sacred Romance. It's written by John Eldridge and Brent Curtis. Just a gal at work just haphazardly mentioned it to me, and I picked it up, and it reintroduced the story of the scripture in just such a way that I thought, how did I grow up in spiritual community all these years and somehow we missed this? Mm-hmm. We missed it. So I remember part of that book, they talk about how your life is a love story set in the midst of a life and death battle. And they talk a lot about Isaiah 61 and how Jesus came to heal us from our brokenness and our bondage. And being really perplexed by that. I'm a good girl. I have an easy story. What brokenness, what bondage? And so after I read that book, it was about 5 years later that God took it from just reading a book to like actually inviting me to engage the content of that book. And that was like the beginning of a huge life change for me, of really re-engaging my story and learning to kind of tell the truth of what my story was and is.
So 5 years after reading The Sacred Romance, you start to reflect on your heart and your story in deeper ways.
I did. Actually, 5 years after reading that book, I was coming out of my first experience of depression. I had some postpartum depression with my second child and had dealt with it in counseling and even through the care of medication, and really was told that I was well and I felt well, but I felt such a lack of joy. And I remember standing in my kitchen one day while the boys were gone to Mother's Day out and really crying out saying, is this all that there is? Like, I really think there is more to life, to my story than this. Like in that moment, Adam, God brought to mind that book that I had read 5 years earlier, and it led me upstairs to our desktop computer to see if that ministry had anything else to offer me, because I wasn't hearing anything different in the church than I had heard as a little girl. And so I logged on, and sure enough, they had a women's retreat, and just an impulsive act signed up to go on this women's retreat. And it was a really radical choice for me, because at the time I would not go out by myself. I wouldn't go have a coffee with friends by myself. My boys were kind of my buffer. So I signed up for this retreat and told my husband about it. And he said, if you get an invitation, you're going. I wholeheartedly support that. And so I think one of the bravest things I did was about 5 months later, got on an airplane and flew to Colorado for this retreat. And it was there that I did start to journal some memories and hear about things like trauma and wounds that we have. And I had no context for trauma. I had no understanding for that other than huge things that had not happened to me. And one of the things that I heard was, don't minimize your story. Don't minimize your story. So I remember feeling the permission to tell the truth as I journaled about what it was like for me as a little girl. So I think that was the initial engagement of my story, was in that journal. Just even asking questions about things I don't even remember, like, why can't I remember this part of my story? So I think it really began engaging my story I would have been 35 at that time. So it's been about 15 years of story engagement since then.
And so as a 35-year-old woman, 5 years after reading The Sacred Romance, you're at this retreat and you are invited to not minimize your story. What did that mean to you then?
One of the things that they led us in was naming some agreements that we have believed about ourselves. And I remember that part came really easily to me. I mean, it was almost like a fire hydrant of things. What do I believe about myself? And I remember just pouring from my pen words like, I'm too much, and I'm not enough. And in the end, I'll be alone. And just sentences just poured onto the page, and not understanding like what the formative stories were for those sentences. But I knew that they were the deepest things that I felt about myself and about my story, both past, present, and future. Like, I knew that my future would be that I am going to end up abandoned and alone. Like, it felt so true. And so, part of their ministry is like leading us into what does God say is truth, and then some healing prayer. And so it was my first experience ever with naming lies and replacing them with truth, and engaging in conversational intimacy with God to actually just say, who am I? It was interesting because some of the things that came back to me even that first weekend at that retreat were things that I can remember as a little girl knowing were true. Like, I can remember at 6, 7, 8 reading my Bible story book and knowing when I would read about Mary encountering the divine, like, I have the capacity for that, right? But it had been so dormant for so long. And it was almost like catching a glimpse of that little girl, like curled up in the family room with that book on my lap, knowing like I believed it once.
Yes.
And so it was really a sweet beginning of God returning some truths to me that he had taught me as a young girl and that had just really been diminished and, of course, assaulted. And so I think it has really been an unfolding of just continual like renaming.
And you knew as a girl, before the good girl messages overtook you, before the submissive wife, be a sweet, nice Christian woman, before that began to dominate your life, you were this girl who knew that you were created for something epic and something divine.
Right, right.
And the stories that you read in your Bible leapt into your heart, not as something that you couldn't experience, but that something that was telling you about what's available for Susan. And then you begin to reconnect with that passion and that sense of wonder as a 35-year-old woman at this retreat.
Yep.
And it was through the ministry of Ransomed Heart. Yes?
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah. And so as you are beginning, you write down some of these agreements, you put words to things that have bound you for decades. As you're beginning to not minimize your story and to look at it, what are some of the fears or obstacles that you begin to encounter as you start down this path?
I think one of the things that was profoundly difficult in telling the truth is a sense of obligation to honor my parents. As an adopted child, I have a profound sense of gratitude for my parents giving me a home. And so it was very difficult to tell the truth about my story because I wanted to be very careful not to throw them under the bus. So when I started to engage in my story, even as I would journal, I felt such a profound obligation to honor my parents and be very careful not to name anything that would hurt them or bring a sense of accusation that they weren't good parents. And so I can remember even in the journaling that weekend, I have parts of that journal where I've blacked out, gone back and redacted things that I wrote because naming it felt so shameful to say anything about them that would be negative at all. I do love them deeply, and as an adopted little girl, I felt a profound sense of gratitude to have somebody who would want me and would take me into their home and love me as their daughter. And so to name things about our home that perhaps didn't look wonderful felt really risky and like I was not loving them well. And so that was a really difficult challenge. And quite honestly, it still is. It's hard to name things about what I needed and did not receive. But that's to tell the truth. It was okay for me to need those things, and I didn't receive them.
And even now, I mean, as you're talking, like it's costing you a lot to fumble for words, to find the balance between how do I honor the fact that these two people chose me and brought me into their home, and yet how do I also acknowledge that in many ways they failed me and they didn't provide me what I needed. And it's costing you something even to try and put language to that bind that you've been in your whole life, but especially as you've begun to engage your story.
Yeah, I think that sentence, I'm too much, really comes into play there because I came to speak that sentence over the needs that I had, that it was just too much that I needed. I had too big a heart. I was too emotional. I needed too much attention. And the reality is I have a big heart and I have big emotions, but that's not something that I am to be ashamed of. I mean, it is the way I'm made. And I see now, like, I love that about myself. Like, I love that, but it felt like too much because they did not have the capacity. It's
so interesting to hear you put in sequence, big heart big emotions too much. It was your big heart that was reading those Bible stories as a 6, 7, 8-year-old girl and finding herself in the epic story of God's work in the world. I mean, that's because you had that big heart. The reason the stories mattered to you is because you had big feelings. And so the bind, of course, is that we could say a simple word. It's your glory that's getting you in trouble with your parents because they don't know what to do with your big heart and your big emotions. And to say it more succinctly, they don't know what to do with the image of God in you and how much of it you bear. And so I'm imagining you were at some level, whether overtly, covertly, verbally, non-verbally, cursed as being too much.
Yeah, it's interesting. A few years ago, somebody who's a spiritual leader in my life used the term "suck it up" in a sermon he was preaching. And I can remember almost having to leave the room. It affected me so profoundly. And I think that was a message that little girl heard a lot. Suck it up, buttercup. Let's dry it up. And there was learning how to shut it down.
To shut the bigness down.
Yeah.
To shut the passion down, the big feelings down, the big joy, the big fear, the big passion, the big all of it. To tame it and make it smaller. And from what little I know of you, you didn't do a very good job of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the effort to do it, it leads me back to that morning in the kitchen where I cried out to God, like, where is the joy? And I think it was a Brene Brown quote that answered that question for me, where she says, you can't selectively numb your emotions. When you deaden one emotion, you're choosing to deaden them all. And so I really had shut my heart down, and it was profoundly affecting my marriage, my family, my children. Again, that journal from that weekend, Adam, when I go back and read about the woman I'm describing in that journal, I don't recognize her. Because I am alive now, right? Like, now I've accessed that. And so I'm not afraid of grief anymore. And so because I can grieve big, I have a lot of joy. Because I can risk big and be really courageous, I can also have a lot of contentment and peace. And so that's the fruit of entering my story.
And so the complexity is you both failed at making yourself small, and in many ways you succeeded for a long season, at numbing the big feelings so that you would not be an inconvenience to your parents. And maybe that's a good place to begin, or to segue into your story, because it bears on these themes.
Saturday night in my childhood home was bath night. After the Love Boat ended, my sister and I were sent to our rooms to take turns in the bathroom. While I waited, I could hear "Deplane" echoing down the hallway, and I knew that Mom and Dad were watching Fantasy Island. Sometimes I would tiptoe down the hallway, stand behind the bifold doors leading to the family room, and peep at the television through the crack. I would hold my breath, knowing that I wasn't allowed to watch this adults-only show. When I heard the tub start draining, I would tiptoe back to my room undiscovered. Saturday nights weren't the only time I would sneak down the hall. There were many nights I would either lie in my bed, listening to my sister sleep in the neighboring twin bed, or awaken in the dark room. I could faintly hear the sound of the television in the distance and see its glow gently lighting the hallway. I would will myself to stay in bed, hoping that eventually I would find sleep. But when I failed, I would slip out of bed and begin my short, silent walk down the hall. The golden shag carpet muffled my footsteps, and at the hall's end, I would slip behind the door. Through the crack, I could see the television straight ahead. To the right, I could see my father's raised feet as he sat in his lazy boy recliner. Mom was somewhere in the room, but I couldn't see her. Maybe she was sitting on the couch out of my view. As I stood there, I leaned against the wall, careful not to move the door on its hinges and be discovered. The shaft of light, glimpse of my father, and intermittent sound of their voices made me feel safe, and against the wall I would breathe slow, deep breaths and felt myself relax. On some nights I crept down the hall because of fear. Sometimes it was the fear of vampires, even though I had carefully tucked my bed covers under my chin and gripped the covers tightly against the mattress with clenched fists. Maybe it wasn't a good idea to take a 9-year-old to see Love at First Bite. Sometimes it was a fear of being alone. Though my sister slept only feet away, I knew better than to wake her. Sometimes it was the fear that I dreaded the most, one that began in my heart and then plunged into my belly. It was a fear that as a young girl I could not name. All I knew is that once I entertained it for a second, it drew me into the depth of panic that propelled me out of bed and down the hall. It never crossed my mind to call out for Mom or Dad or to simply walk into the family room. Instead, I would slide behind the door and wait until sleep beckoned me back to bed. On one particular night, I became so tired that I could no longer stand behind the door without giving myself away. Yet I wasn't ready to leave the warmth of the light and the nearness of my parents. Instead, I laid down in the hallway just beyond the doors. I knew I could lie here undiscovered until I felt ready to return to bed. I laid on my stomach and made a pillow for my head with my hands. The texture of the shag carpet felt scratchy against my arms and legs. I closed my eyes, but I remained aware of the television sounds and its fluorescent glow. Suddenly, I awoke, shocked by a deep silence in the house. I recognized that the television was off, which meant my parents must have gone to bed. I felt the carpet beneath me and remembered I was still in the hallway. I knew I needed to get up and return to bed. However, I could not move. I couldn't move my body. I couldn't open my eyes. It felt like my brain was awake, but it had not informed my body of this transition. Panic rose in me as I told different parts of my body to respond, yet nothing happened. I felt like I was anchored by sandbags. I tried to open my eyes, move my toes, and wiggle my fingers to no avail. I was left with only one option, which was my last resort, to cry out for help. I couldn't open my mouth, but I thought if I could generate a scream, then perhaps it would burst through my sealed lips. It began as a whimper in the back of my throat and then grew into a groan. I could hear it. Could anyone else? Finally, it broke through the paralysis that was gripping me, and my body became filled with life once again. I rolled to my side and laid in the hallway, listening for footsteps coming from my parents' bedroom. I wondered how I would explain my presence on the hallway floor. Would they panic upon finding me there? Would they be angry? I don't think they ever came. I can't recall how I got from the hallway to the room that night, but I imagine that I stood up and tiptoed quietly back to my bed. I must have slid under the covers, tucked them tightly under my chin, and slept until the morning.
Thank you, Susan, for reading the story, for reading it slowly. So can we kind of walk through parts of it together?
Sure.
The sentence that jumps out to me the most, and that seems kind of thematic over the whole story, is when you said, "It never crossed my mind to call out for Mom or Dad or to simply walk into the family room."
Mm-hmm.
As I say that, what comes up for you? That sentence moves me.
It's a mystery to me why that wasn't an option for me. I don't remember strict rules in our home that was off limits, but I knew.
You knew?
I knew. Like in my brain, in my body, in my heart, I knew like it was their time, it was their space, and I was not invited into that room.
And so there's an unwritten, unspoken, maybe one time spoken, but there's a rule. And the rule is when you are in need, even pretty significant fear, you're not to interrupt. You're not to reach out and cry out for help. You're not to come in.
Right.
You knew it wasn't okay, and you knew that there would have been consequences. And whether you were aware of those consequences or not, it's almost as if this is so deep that it wasn't even a multiple choice option that you even considered. You didn't consider it.
Mm-mm.
And so we can say a simple sentence. The aloneness of this girl is immense.
Yes. And I think I know that I would have been alone had I gone in the room or had I stayed behind the door. And so it's funny because I remember that door very fondly, and that space, that crevice behind the door.
You remember it fondly, the crevice,
mm-hmm.
the door. Yeah. Why do you think that is?
It was a very safe space for me. I got as much nearness that I was going to get, even if I had gone in the room. I still got it from then, and I didn't risk rejection. Like, I needed more, and going in and not receiving them more would have hurt so deeply. So being in the safe spot of the crevice behind the door protected me from knowing that that's all you're going to get, right? I think I just learned that just their nearness was as much as I was going to get.
Right.
And how to soothe with what was available to me.
Yeah. And so it's important to acknowledge that you received some measure of comfort from their nearness.
Mm-hmm.
And you were clear that it was all you were going to get.
Mm-hmm.
And it did provide some soothing.
Mm-hmm.
For many of us, when we look back on our growing up years, even if we had abusive parents, there will often be times when we longed for the nearness of our parents, and we felt it, and we got some measure of it, and there was some measure of safety. And this story kind of illustrates how it was a morsel of what you needed. Mm-hmm. But you knew how to navigate your world to secure that morsel, and you knew how to not jeopardize it. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the tragedy of this is immense. But the bind, of course, is that you think of this little spot fondly, mm-hmm. because you were comforted there. Mm-hmm. But it was such an impoverished comfort. Mm-hmm. But it was all that was available to you. And by that age, you knew what was available and what was not. And you found a way to get as much as you were going to get to comfort your terrified heart.
Mm-hmm. The idea of like existing on morsels really resonates. It makes me think of, a beggar getting scraps and existing on those. And I think I learned how to exist on meager portions, because to me that felt what I needed felt like too much. And so I, in my translation, thought what I need is too much. So this must be the normal portion that other people can thrive on. And so learn to thrive on this because that's normal. What you want is too much.
Right. This is so important, what you're putting language to, Susan. So I just want to pause and slow this down, because what you're saying is that you began to do some math in your head. And the math was, since it's clear to my parents that my needs are way too much, this morsel of comfort, i.e., and let's be clear about what a tiny morsel this is, they don't even know you're there. You are simply within, 6-8 feet proximity of you can see your dad's leg, you can see him on the lazy chair, but you are outside the room, peering through a closed door, hearing the sounds of the TV, seeing the light. There's some measure of comfort. And the math that you did in your head was, this must be what a normal girl would be comforted by, mm-hmm. because my needs are so jacked up.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And so in doing that math, you're making an agreement that your needs are way too much.
Yes.
And you began to live with that agreement as a little girl.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so as you grow with that agreement that your needs are too much, and that a morsel is what a normal girl would be satisfied by, mm-hmm. what does that cost you? How does that play out?
Yeah, well, it translates into every relationship every relationship that you have, every longing that I had, whether in relationship with friendships or boys as I grew up. Clearly, I needed more than they could offer and more than was right to expect. And so I ended up settling, to use your word, for morsels. And I think it reinforced the message, right? It just continually reinforced the message to where it became such a deep-seated understanding about something that was just deeply wrong with me, that it didn't just feel true, it really became truth for me.
Yeah, and so just to put some framework on this, what evil does is it takes those places in our hearts that most bear the glory of God, which for you, at least two of them are your big passion and your big feelings, your sensitivity, your aliveness. And what evil does is it curses and mars and marks and shames those very parts of us so that we begin to agree that they're bad, and we begin to live in such a way to minimize them, to keep them small. And that becomes the debris of our relational life. I know that you have begun to address said agreements, perhaps starting at that conference as a 35-year-old woman, but take us inside a little bit. What has it looked like to contend with "you're too much" the past 15 years?
I think that there are some agreements that when you see the truth of them and engage in rescripting those agreements with truth, it's fairly quickly that you can then begin to live in that truth. I would say that the agreement of being too much is an agreement that I contend with regularity. Even dreaming dreams for the next part of my life as we enter the empty nest. The dreams are too big. It's too much. It's too much to ask for. It's too much to hope for. Who are you to think that you could do that? It's too late. And recognizing the script is the same script. And so honestly, Adam, I find myself creeping behind that door. I have come to recognize that door is a location that I have taken with me into my adult life. And I'm pretty skilled at disappearing behind the door. And I sometimes I think it is caring for myself well when I'm in an unsafe relationship or an unsafe place, or I'm being triggered or flooded, that sometimes going into that shadow behind the door just for some self-care is okay. And it's the right choice for me to make at that time. There are other times I see that I slip behind that door, though, because the courage that's required to stay out of the shadow, i.e. to enter that room, right? And you may receive from your parents what you most desire in your heart, but it's also a huge risk. You may not. And learning to be brave enough to go into the room because I'm needed in the room. And so that's been something that I have learned to really pay attention to. Where am I? And when I am behind the door, to really be able to engage the question of why am I here again?
Say more about your tendency to find yourself still behind that door, because that feels really important. There's an isolation there, but there's a comfort there, but there's a hiding there.
As I've engaged my story and really come to own my big heart, my big emotions, my big desire, like wanting to live fully in that glory, it still is not always welcome, right? It's still not understood. I'm still in the South. I'm still in a very similar church culture that I grew up in. And the script is really the same for women by and large. And so I'm not okay with that, living in that script anymore. And so it feels like I live a risky life when I live in fullness. And so for me, that door is always kind of there. And the temptation is to play it small, to scooch behind the door, to shrink myself to fit behind the door. And I think sometimes that is kindness. I think I do have a wisdom and a discernment of when it is safe to bring my whole self and whole heart to situations and to people. But then also learning to walk in, am I walking in wisdom and discernment, or am I walking in fear? And when I find myself tucking myself behind the door because I'm afraid, what it means for me as a 49-year-old woman caring for that little girl behind the door is to say, come out, I'm with you, you're safe.
So let's talk, if we could, about caring. You now as a 49-year-old woman, how has your posture towards the girl behind the door changed over the years? And how do you engage her now?
I love that little girl. I really love her heart. I love her passion. I think she was really wise and discerning as a little girl. She was lost to me for a really long time. And so being mindful of her constant presence with me and really wanting to do a good job caring for her, I feel very in tune with her and very aware of what it means to engage her heart the way her heart needed to be engaged back then, but was not. And so that means having the patience and the care to say, what do you need right now? You don't seem okay. And really responding to her. I think some of the practice for that is being a mom myself. Like, I know how I've cared for my two boys. And so offering her the patience and the compassion, the approach of, they never hesitated to approach me and knew that they were always welcome to climb up in my lap and be cared for. And so being able to just give her that same sense of welcome.
It strikes me that what you're wanting and what you're committed to offering her in asking her, what do you need right now? That's actually all she needed that night behind the door. Mm-hmm. She needed a mother or father to open the door and say, sweetie, what's happening? What do you need right now? Are you okay? And that's what you're offering her now.
Right. Yeah. And I think like one thing I deeply needed and would have loved is for somebody to see my face.
Yes.
And without even words, be able to respond. And so even that practice of attunement to her is very important for me, to just pay attention to her face and respond. I remember a few years ago, my husband and I started taking some ballroom dance lessons, and I was not well, honestly. After the second lesson, I was not doing well. And I realized that it is not me that's not okay. It's 17-year-old me, not okay. And being able to care for her, and that was new for me. It was really new. It felt very strange, but saying, like, what do you need from me so that you can feel safe going into your dance lesson next Friday? And so it honestly meant saying, you don't have to come with me. Like, I've got this. Like, I've got this. Like, I can handle this. You're good. And it was a new practice, right? I'm looking in the mirror, this full-length mirror at the dance studio, and I don't recognize the reflection of the woman looking at me. It's okay. I've got this. Like, I can be brave. You don't have to come into this tonight. And so even learning, even it felt very faltering. It still feels very faltering to offer that care to her. But it's that attunement that I really, really longed for, that I long to be attuned to her and be able to have that dialogue and practice the kind of care that she really would have loved to receive.
Yeah. And when you said that sentence, I really would have liked someone to see my face. Mm-hmm. Say more about that. What do you mean?
I remember when my boys were young, I read this interview by Toni Morrison, and she was talking about when her children, she had two sons, when they were young, that when they came into the kitchen, she would make sure their shoes were tied and their belts were looped correctly. And she would send them out and she would think she had done a great job. And somebody told her that's not attunement. Attunement is when your boys walk into the room that your face lights up. Does your face light up when your boys walk into the room? Like, that's what they need from you. That was a profound gift to hear that as I was a young mom raising my boys, like to pause from what I thought mothering meant to just like let my face light up with my boys. And I did. I mean, I still do. My oldest one's 20. And when he walks in the room, my face just lights up. I long for that. I love for somebody to be so attuned to me that when I walk in the room, it's not for anything other than just joy of, you're here.
Yes.
Adam, my heart so deeply responds to that. And even in saying I deeply respond to that, it feels like a disproportionate response. Like it feels like too much, how much joy that gives me. Like when you see my face and you smile, that big smile, and you light up just because I'm here. Oh, like that to me is so life-giving. And the converse is true. When that doesn't happen, I can feel myself wilt like a flower.
Yes.
Wilt like a flower. And it's interesting, as I started to go back and do some story work, I don't feel like I have a multitude of memories of stories to tell, but the heart I have now is the heart I had as that little girl. Like it's the same heart. And so if at 49, my heart falls when you don't respond, when I was 9 years old, my heart fell when you did not respond. The hurt and sorrow I feel when you don't respond to me, just my presence. If I feel that at 49, I know that I felt that at 9.
Yes.
And so even being able to make that connection has been a profound gift, to know how she must have felt and then to love her in her loneliness and in her need.
And what you're putting words to is so core to how God created us as human beings. We are created in the image of a triune God, and the essence of the Trinity is mutual delight. And we could say it this way: their faces light up when they see one another. And each one of us is created to enter a room and to see other people's faces light up because we are there and because they delight in us. And what you're saying is that as a 49-year-old woman, you're keenly aware of that, and you felt that as a girl as well. Mm-hmm. And we feel it our whole life long unless we numb our desire to be delighted in. And the woman hiding behind the door, whether it's you now or you as a girl, is unsure if the faces inside the room will receive her if she enters.
Now I have the capacity to care for myself and care for her if the face doesn't light up, right? Like I can name, like, it's not because you're too much, sweetie. It's not because you wanted too much or your expectations were too great or you're unreasonable. Now, how can I care for you in what you're feeling now because you didn't experience that? And so I think part of growing in this is learning how to care for myself both then and now, because I light up for her. Like I light up, like even her courage right now to be sitting talking to you.
Totally.
I'm like so proud of her. I'm so proud of myself because like this is really hard for me. And I feel really felt very much like coming out from behind that door to talk to you today.
Yes. And so it is with gratitude and on behalf of the listeners. I mean, I get emails, but you're not privy to them, or most guests, sometimes I forward them. But the point is people are expressing gratitude for the courage of the guests that come on and share their stories. And so I can tell you just from my own heart that it has been a sweet privilege to see your vulnerable face as you have wrestled with today, and such gratitude and such a privilege to hear not just your story, but really, frankly, your reflection on how this story has continued to shape you throughout your adult life and where you are still wrestling. and what that process has looked like for you. Such a gift. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Adam.